before the world was fully at war. Before American soldiers stormed beaches or tanks rolled across Europe, there was a radical idea taking shape in the United States. In the early 1930s. Military leaders were already studying the scars left behind by World War I trenches, stalemates, endless bloodshed. Many believed the next global conflict wouldn't be decided the same way. What if, instead of grinding armies against each other on the ground, you could strike directly at an enemy's industrial heart? What if you could break a nation's ability to fight before its soldiers ever reached the battlefield? That question changed everything. The U.S. Army Air Corps began searching for something that didn't quite exist yet, a bomber that could fly farther than any before it, higher than enemy fighters could easily reach, and strong enough to defend itself deep inside hostile territory. At the time, the idea sounded almost unrealistic. Most bombers were vulnerable, slow, and heavily dependent on fighter protection. Sending them alone over enemy territory was often a death sentence, but American engineers believed technology could tip the balance. In 1935, a sleek four-engine aircraft rolled out onto a runway for evaluation. It dwarfed the twin-engine bombers of its time. When reporters saw it bristling with multiple machine gun positions, they reportedly called it a flying fortress. The name stuck, and the B-17 Flying Fortress was born with a reputation before it ever saw combat. This wasn't just another airplane. It represented a bold military philosophy that daylight precision bombing, carried out by tight formations of heavily armed bombers, could cripple an enemy's factories, rail lines, oil refineries, and production centers. The theory was simple: destroy the machinery of war and you destroy the war itself. But theories don't fly missions. Machines do. And the B-17 was built with one thing in mind: survival. Four powerful engines gave it the range to cross vast stretches of ocean and continent. Its high aspect wings allowed it to operate at altitudes above 25,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to dangerously low levels and oxygen grew thin. Inside, crews would wear heated suits and oxygen masks, their breath freezing in the air as they scanned the skies for threats. And then there were the guns. Early models carried multiple .50 caliber machine guns positioned in the nose, dorsal turret, waist, and tail. Later versions added even more defensive firepower. The concept was revolutionary for its time. Instead of relying solely on escorts, the bomber would defend itself. When flown in close formations, sometimes called combat boxes, the overlapping fields of fire created a protective web of bullets around the group. Enemy fighters wouldn't just be attacking one plane. They'd be flying into a storm of coordinated defense. It was an audacious belief that discipline, formation flying, and sheer firepower could hold off interceptors long enough to complete the mission. And for a while, that confidence grew. American planners believed that if these bombers could reach their targets in broad daylight, not under the cover of darkness, they could strike with far greater accuracy. Factories, shipyards, aircraft assembly plants, all of it could be systematically dismantled. The air war wouldn't just support ground troops. It would lead the war itself. But there was another layer to the story, one that made the B-17 more than metal and rivets. It became a symbol of American industrial power. The United States was still emerging from the Great Depression when the aircraft program accelerated. Massive factories came alive. Assembly lines stretched across hangars. Thousands of workers, men and women, riveted aluminum panels, installed engines, wired cockpits, and mounted gun turrets. The bomber wasn't just a weapon. It was proof that American manufacturing could outproduce any adversary, and that mattered. Because across the Atlantic, tensions were rising fast. In Europe, expansionist aggression was reshaping borders and igniting fears of another catastrophic conflict. Military observers were watching the skies closely, knowing air power would play a decisive role. The question wasn't whether bombers would be used, it was whether they could survive. The B-17 was America's answer. Still, underneath the confidence, there were doubts. Could formations truly protect themselves against determined fighter attacks? Would high-altitude bombing be as precise as planners hoped? Could young crews, many barely out of high school, handle the stress of hours inside a freezing aluminum shell while enemy defenses reached up from below? Those questions lingered quietly in the background as production ramped up. When the United States eventually entered the war, these aircraft would cross the Atlantic and begin operating from bases in England. Their polished aluminum bodies would reflect the gray skies as they assembled into massive formations, engines rumbling in unison. From the ground they looked unstoppable, like floating cities of steel, but the skies over Europe were not empty. The bold gamble that shaped the B-17's design, the belief that it could fly deep into enemy territory and fight its way out, was about to face the most brutal test imaginable. What had begun as an ambitious theory inside design rooms and strategy briefings would soon collide with reality over heavily defended cities, and as those bombers prepared for their first true combat missions, one thing became clear: this wasn't just an aircraft experiment anymore. It was the opening move in a new kind of war, one fought miles above the earth, where survival depended on engineering, formation discipline, and the courage of 10 men sealed inside a flying fortress. When those polished aluminum bombers finally began crossing the English countryside and forming up over the North Sea, the theory was about to meet something far more unforgiving than blueprints and strategy meetings. It met reality. From airfields in eastern England, young American crews climbed into their B-17 flying fortress before dawn. The engines coughed to life one by one, propellers slicing through cold morning air. Inside the fuselage, there was no insulation. No real comfort, just exposed metal, wiring, ammunition belts, and the constant vibration of 4 engines pushing thousands of pounds into the sky. As they gained altitude, the temperature plummeted. At 25,000 feet, it could drop to 40 degrees below zero. Frost formed on the inside of the aircraft. Oxygen masks became lifelines. Frostbite was a real threat. And they hadn't even reached enemy territory yet. Then the coastline of occupied Europe would appear beneath them. At first, it might look almost peaceful from that height: patchwork fields, winding rivers, small towns. But every man on board knew that below those clouds were anti-aircraft batteries already calculating their altitude and speed. And beyond that, weighted interceptors ready to tear through aluminum. The United States committed to daylight bombing over Nazi Germany because they believed in precision. They believed in accuracy. They believed the B-17's defensive firepower, flying in tight combat formations, could protect itself long enough to hit critical industrial targets and return home. But the German defenses adapted quickly. The first sign was usually flak. Black bursts would suddenly bloom in the sky, dark, violent explosions that looked almost slow from a distance. But inside the formation, they were terrifying. Each burst hurled razor-sharp metal fragments in every direction. A direct hit could rip off a wing. Even a near miss could shred control cables, puncture fuel tanks, or kill crew members instantly, and flak wasn't random. It was timed and measured. Guided by radar and ground observers, who knew exactly where those bombers would be in seconds, then came the fighters. German pilots in aircraft like the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf didn't just circle and harass. They attacked aggressively, often head-on, the most dangerous angle for a bomber crew. Closing speeds could exceed 600 miles per hour. That meant only seconds to fire before the enemy flashed past the nose in a blur of gunfire. Inside the B-17, every gunner locked into position. Waist gunners braced themselves against the freezing wind that tore through open windows. The ball turret gunner, crammed into a tiny glass sphere beneath the aircraft, scanned for threats from below. The tail gunner stared directly into the path of pursuing fighters. Knowing he was often the last line of defense, the sky became chaos. Tracer rounds stitched across open air. Engines caught fire. Formations broke apart under pressure. And sometimes, bombers simply vanished. One of the most devastating examples came during the raids over Schweinfurt, a key center of German ball-bearing production. American planners understood how critical those factories were to the enemy's war machine. Destroy them, and you could cripple tank production. Aircraft manufacturing, everything depended on precision bearings. So they sent the B-17s deep into heavily defended airspace. The cost was staggering. On missions in 1943, dozens of bombers were shot down in a single day. Entire crews, 10 men per aircraft, disappeared into fire and smoke. Survivors recalled watching neighboring planes explode mid-air, wings shearing off, parachutes sometimes appearing, sometimes not, and here's the part that's hard to comprehend. Many of these airmen were barely 19 or 20 years old. They knew the statistics. They understood that completing 25 missions, the number required for a combat tour early in the war, was statistically unlikely during certain periods. Yet they kept climbing back into those aircraft. Why? Part of it was duty. Part of it was loyalty to the men beside them. But part of it was something else, a belief that what they were doing mattered. That every factory hit, every rail yard destroyed, shortened the war by even a fraction. And despite the horrific losses, something remarkable happened. The B-17 proved unbelievably resilient. There are documented cases of aircraft returning to base with entire sections of fuselage missing, tails nearly severed, engines shot out. Planes riddled with hundreds of holes still managed to limp back across the channel. Crews would land, step out, and see daylight shining through shredded aluminum. Where solid metal used to be, ground crews often stood in disbelief at what made it home. That durability reinforced the legend. The flying fortress wasn't invincible, far from it, but it could absorb punishment in ways few aircraft of its era could. Its rugged design, redundant systems, and disciplined formations gave crews at least a fighting chance. Still, by late 1943, the reality was undeniable. Flying unescorted deep into Germany was unsustainable. Loss rates threatened to cripple the bombing campaign entirely. The bold pre-war theory that bombers alone could defend themselves had reached its breaking point. And this is where the story pivots. The sacrifice over places like Schweinfurt forced strategic change. It exposed the limits of self-defense and made one thing crystal clear. If the bombing campaign was going to succeed, it needed protection all the way to the target and back. The skies over Europe had become a brutal proving ground. The B-17 had endured fire, flak, and relentless fighter attacks. It had proven its toughness. Its crews had demonstrated extraordinary courage under impossible odds, but survival alone wasn't enough to win the air war. Something had to shift, and when that shift finally came, when long-range escorts began, accompanying those formations deep into enemy territory, the balance of power in the skies would change in a way that reshaped the war itself. By late 1943, the air war over Europe stood at a crossroads. The courage of the crews had never been in question. The toughness of the B-17 flying fortress had been proven again and again in shredded aluminum and miracle landings. But courage and durability alone weren't enough. The losses had been too heavy. The gamble that bombers could fight their way deep into enemy territory without continuous protection had reached its limit. And then the equation changed. The arrival of long-range fighter escorts, especially the P-51 Mustang, transformed the skies. Unlike earlier escorts that had to turn back before reaching deep targets, these new fighters could stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. That single development reshaped the air war. Now, when B-17 formations assembled over England and droned toward the continent, they weren't alone. German fighter pilots who once waited confidently for isolated bomber streams suddenly faced aggressive escorts that could meet them head-on. Instead of calmly setting up attack runs, they were forced into defensive dogfights. The balance shifted from interception to attrition. Every time German fighters rose to challenge the bombers, they risked being shot down before even reaching firing position, and that shift had consequences far beyond a single mission. The strategy was no longer just about hitting factories. It became about forcing the enemy into the air again and again, draining experienced pilots, destroying aircraft production, and systematically eroding the Luftwaffe's ability to defend its own airspace. Each escort-protected bombing run became both a strike on industry and a trap for defending fighters. The B-17, once fighting for survival, now became the centerpiece of a coordinated offensive machine, with improved protection. Bombing accuracy and frequency increased. Oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, aircraft assembly lines, rail networks, they were hit repeatedly. Germany's war machine ran on fuel, steel, and precision manufacturing. And when oil production began collapsing under relentless bombing, the consequences rippled everywhere. Tanks couldn't move. Training flights were reduced. Mechanized divisions struggled with shortages. Even the most advanced weapons are useless without fuel. The sustained bombing campaign placed enormous strain on the infrastructure supporting Adolf Hitler's regime. Factories were forced underground. Production was dispersed. Resources were diverted from the front lines to air defense. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns that could have supported ground operations were instead pointed skyward, trying to stop the endless formations overhead, and overhead they came. Day after day, massive streams of bombers stretched for miles, engines humming in synchronized rhythm. Sunlight glinted off aluminum skins as contrails carved white scars across the sky. What had once been vulnerable missions now looked like overwhelming force. The psychological impact alone was immense. Civilians and soldiers alike could see and hear the growing dominance in the air. Air superiority isn't just about shooting down planes. It's about control. It's about who moves freely and who hides. By 1944, that control was tilting decisively. As preparations for the D-Day invasion accelerated. Allied planners understood that success on the beaches depended heavily on the skies. German reinforcements needed to be slowed. Railways needed to be disrupted. Fuel depots needed to burn. The bombing campaign, with the B-17 as one of its primary instruments, helped isolate the battlefield before Allied troops ever landed in Normandy. When ground forces finally stormed ashore, German air response was limited. The Luftwaffe, once feared and dominant early in the war, had been worn down. Experienced pilots were gone. Fuel shortages restricted operations. Replacement training had been rushed and inadequate. The cumulative effect of sustained bombing in air combat had hollowed out the ability to contest Allied air power effectively. None of this happened overnight. It was the result of relentless pressure, and at the center of that pressure stood the flying fortress. It's important to understand something here. The B-17 wasn't the fastest bomber of the war. It didn't carry the largest payload compared to some later aircraft. It wasn't sleek or agile. What it represented was consistency, the ability to show up, absorb punishment, deliver its bombs, and come back to do it again. Over 12,000 B-17s were built. They became symbols not just of military capability, but of industrial momentum. American factories kept producing. Crews kept training. Missions kept flying. Even when losses were painful, replacements arrived. The sheer scale of output became part of the strategy itself. The air war turned into a battle of endurance, production versus destruction. By the final year of the conflict in Europe, Allied aircraft roamed German skies with increasing freedom. Strategic targets were in ruins. Transportation networks were fractured. Fuel production was crippled. The ability of the regime to sustain prolonged, coordinated resistance weakened dramatically. And when historians look back at how the air campaign contributed to the collapse of Nazi Germany, the image that often comes to mind is that of tight bomber formations high above the clouds, contrails, stretching across the horizon, escorted by sleek fighters pressing forward despite flak bursts and smoke. The B-17 didn't win the war alone. No single machine did, but it became one of the defining tools of a strategy that reshaped modern warfare. The idea that air power could systematically dismantle an enemy's capacity to fight, from an ambitious theory in the 1930s to brutal proving grounds over Europe, to overwhelming aerial dominance in the final years of the war. The flying fortress carved its place into history, not because it was flawless, but because it endured and kept coming back.